But this is what they seem to be attempting to make an equivalence with. There's an equivalence that they want to make with black people, that community. Black people in particular. Because black people are the poster children, if we would say it like that, for the oppressed. Black people in America and around the world are the prototype of the oppressed. If you want to compare oppression, you have to look at black people in America and around the world. And then everything else is after that. And of course, there are arguments to be like, you know what? There's some white people that oppress, not like black people. Because while some people like to say falsely in most cases, but in some other cases true, that black people had slaves. Okay. Some white people enslaved other white people. Okay. The difference is, without going through all of the detail, but the main difference is black people, particularly in America, have been destroyed. Because even the white people that enslaved white people, those white people that they enslaved, they still knew their own language. They still knew their own history. They still knew who they were. And they didn't have a consistent bombardment of the destruction of their culture, their cultural centers in terms of geography, their history and knowledge that they had amassed over centuries, over millennium. They didn't have theirs destroyed. They still knew who they were. They still knew what language they spoke. They still knew what land they came from. They still had a lineage that they could trace with ease, because none of that was destroyed. When they enslaved them, the destruction that black people went through, they didn't go through. There's some places in history books where they say the slave walked beside his master. The slave walked beside his master. Because slavery is not simply about chattel or being chattel, being in chains, being forced to do as another commands you. It's not just that. Before black people in America were enslaved, brought here, some of us were already here. There's an argument by some people saying, well, you know, there were no slave ships, where they are, blah, 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 blah. Like, come on now. I agree. Many of the people that were black were already on this land, and some called them Native Americans or natives or Indians. A lot of black people that were enslaved were already here. Facts. Facts. They were already here. True. But guess what? Some were brought here too from Africa. There are Africans who have records of these things. Yes. There was a transatlantic slave trade. But we were all over the Western Hemisphere because we had already traveled. We understood the currents that went to what is now called America and back to what is now called Africa. We knew how to travel those currents. So we were here, a lot of us, yes, but some of us were brought here too. It can be both. It can be both. So, as I was saying, black people have been destroyed. Our language, our culture, our way of worship, how we worship, even who. Our life, we lived according to a whole other way where everything, every life mattered. In what people call Africa, and even here in what is now called the Americas, when we had fights with one another. In some history, you can read it and it'll be like this nation or this tribe fought and it was a bloody war. It was a bloody war. When we think of bloody, we think of it in the contemporary way we think of bloody. Because to us, bloody is a lot of blood. But what is a lot of blood contextually? When we fought one another and we had a bloody war, that had to do with one person, one death was a bloody war. In the movies, they've depicted David and Goliath. And they would have the Judeans, I think, the house of Judah or the Israelites on one side, and then they had the Philistines on the other. And the Israelites were afraid of the Philistines because they had this champion. His name is Goliath. And they were afraid of him because every time he came about, he was slaying whomever came out. But what would happen is there wasn't a fight where everybody was going to fight each other and kill each other. And all. That wasn't happening. It was one person that they were sending out to represent everybody else. That was Goliath. And in this case, David. And when David slew Goliath, that was a win for the Israelites. That was a win. That wasn't really their history. That was ours. That's how we fought. So when this enemy was coming through Africa, particularly West Africa, and they were slaughtering whole villages and eating people and all this kind of stuff, when we didn't know how to fight like that. We did ceremonial stuff for days on the side, all our people on this side, all their people on this side, doing all this singing and dancing, and then we sent a champion out, and they sent a champion out, and they got to it, and if they subdued that champion, then whoever was subdued lost.